Hi, I'm Brian Joyce, and I have the pleasure of representing 4 of the communities in the Blue Hills Reservation: Milton, Canton, Randolph, and Braintree, along with 6 other towns. We have a very serious problem in the Blue Hills, a public health crisis at this point for some of the surrounding neighborhoods with respect to far too dense deer population. So we've been working on this issue for several years, actually been discussing it since 2009. And the DCR, Department of Conservation and Recreation, along with the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife, have put together a plan to essentially cull the herd. And this was as a result of something I put in the environmental bond bill last year, mandating that they come up with a safe and humane plan to make the reservation safe for all residents, and also to protect the vegetation and the public health. So tonight is the first of a series of public meetings. We want this process to be open and transparent, solicit input. We've already spoken with virtually all of the stakeholders, law enforcement, Friends of the Blue Hills and the like. But we want the general public to have an opportunity to be heard too on this plan, which we hope to implement in December. So enjoy, and please contact me with any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. We're very excited and anxious to share our research that we've done and to hear your feedback. First, I'd like to thank the Department of Fish and Game, the Division of Fisheries and Wildlife, the Massachusetts Environmental Police, Massachusetts State Police, and the Friends of Blue Hills, who have been very helpful to us in this process. Also, I'd like to thank all the delegation of the legislators, State Senator Brian Joyce, State Senator John Keenan, State Representative Bruce Ayers, State Representative Mark Cusack, State Representative William Galvin, and State Representative Walter Timilty. With that, Senator Joyce would like to say a few words, and then I'll come back up to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you, and good evening. So this problem was first brought to my attention in 2009. My name is Brian Joyce, and I have the pleasure of representing 4 of the communities in the Blue Hills Reservation. I have Milton, Canton, Braintree, and Randolph. I also represent 6 other communities in Norfolk, Bristol, and Plymouth counties. It was Denny Swenson and Judy Jacobs, the Friends of the Blue Hills, brought this to my attention really in 2009. And that is the just extraordinary growth in the deer population. We've been talking about this now for 6 years. There are no longer any natural predators to the deer in the Blue Hills. The population has grown extraordinarily, not in a linear fashion, but exponentially. And as a result, we have some real damage to the reservation, to the ecosystem, to the deer eating the undergrowth. We have real concerns with folks not wanting to hike in the reservation. We have cars hitting deer. We had 2 deer struck just within the past 2 hours. But the real concern that I have, the paramount concern I have, is to public health. We have seen an extraordinary growth in tick-borne disease. We're all familiar with Lyme disease. There are 2 other diseases that these deer tick cause. Massachusetts now has one of the highest rates of Lyme disease of any state in the Union. And indeed, here in Norfolk County, we have really a public health epidemic. So we've been discussing this for quite some time. The DCR and also the Division of Fisheries and Wildlife have done an extraordinarily good job in working with all of the stakeholders, not just the Friends of the Blue Hills, but we have representatives here from the state police and local police, folks in law enforcement. We've heard from a lot of people, but to their credit, we want to make sure that we give the public an opportunity to be heard, and that this be a very open and transparent process. They have first, a couple of years ago, did a study that showed the density is in excess of 85 deer per square mile. A healthy deer population is closer to 6 to 18 per square mile. We're 10 times greater density than is healthy for the deer, for the reservation, and for us. They've come up with a plan, a well thought out, well developed plan that protects the public safety, that is modeled after the deer culling that was done at the Quabbin Reservoir going back to the early 1990s, where the overabundance of deer at that point was threatening our public water drinking supply. So I am first very grateful for all of you coming out here this evening, that you'll have an open, honest, fair opportunity to be heard with any concerns, hear the plan, and we will adjust pursuant to the comments that we hear. But this is first and foremost to me a public health concern. It's why I inserted language in the 2014 Environmental Bond Bill mandating that these agencies come up with a safe and effective plan to decrease the deer population, protect our ecosystem, protect our beloved Blue Hills, and mostly protect our public health. So I thank you, and with that, I think would I introduce my friend and former colleague, George Peterson, who is the Commissioner of the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Senator Joyce, and it's indeed a pleasure to be here tonight to get your input into this plan. It's been a long time coming. I, in my previous life, was a legislator for 20 years in the State House as a state representative, and actually worked to get this plan or this language in the Environmental Bond Bill passed back in 2014. I have a couple of employees here from our Department of Fisheries and Wildlife, which have got a lot more expertise and knowledge than I have on the specifics. And if we have questions on those issues, they will be here to help answer those questions. But I want to thank all the people of Fish and Wildlife, DCR, public safety officials, local officials, and you, the public, that are getting involved in this plan as we move forward, and I'm looking forward to your comments tonight. Commissioner?
Okay, let's get into some little bit of details. The Blue Hills, of course, is the crown jewel of DCR portfolio statewide. The reservation is actually one of the first properties to be acquired by the Commonwealth for public recreation. It is a very special place, and we want to make sure we maintain it and preserve it. As stewards of the Blue Hills Reservation, DCR is concerned with the long-term health of the forest, as the Senator stated. DCR's 2011 Resource Management Plan for Blue Hills noted deer overpopulation as a significant problem and recommended some kind of deer management plan. And then the legislator passed the 2014 Environmental Bond Bill, which directed DCR to work with DFW to identify areas where deer overpopulation is negatively impacting water resources and plant growth. It also directed us to develop and implement a harvest management plan for the identified areas. That is, we've been working with that, and if you can see out in the back table, the whole big thick deer management plan. Then we proceeded to start to speak to law enforcement, get their feedback on what they thought. We spoke to municipal heads and with the delegation, and now this is kind of our last phase. And with each of those meetings, each of those contacts, we adjusted for the feedback. So I want you to know that we're here to listen. Based on the RMP and the environmental bond, yeah, we're happy to share with you tonight. I think that's all I have. So what I'd like to do is to turn it over to my expert, Peter Church, and I would ask you to let us go through the presentation because we believe we will answer a lot of your questions, and then as soon as he's done, we will have a question and answer period. We have 2 microphones that we can float out there, so let's get started.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Peter Church. I'm the Director of Forest Stewardship for DCR. I have worked for the state for 26 years. I began my career here in the Blue Hills Reservation, so I'm intimately familiar with this area. What I'm going to do is just go quickly on an overview of what we're going to discuss tonight, a little bit about the nature and causes of why we have too many deer, how the planning efforts have been undertaken, a little bit of an overview of the deer density survey that we did in consultation with the Division of Fish and Wildlife, and what potential options are there, and then what we ultimately decided in terms of our management plan. And then we'll talk a little bit to the Director of Natural Resources for our Water Supply Protection Division in DCR, Dan Clark. He'll talk a little bit about the Quabbin experience. And we will then follow that up with questions and comments. So a little bit about the Blue Hills. Many of you that are here probably know it very well. It's over 7,000 acres. It's in the towns of Milton, Canton, Quincy, Randolph, Dedham, Braintree, and Boston. It was acquired by the Metropolitan Parks Commission in 1893, and is a very large population around the Blue Hills Reservation. We're less than 10 miles as the crow flies from Boston, and a lot of people come and visit the Blue Hills. So what we have and what we've deduced based on our deer survey and what people have seen out in our reservation is that we have too many deer here in the Blue Hills. And some of the causes of an overpopulation of deer lead to overbrowse of vegetation, lack of forest regeneration. So the mature forest that we have above us, there's nothing growing underneath in terms of the next generation of trees. Tick abundance, as the Senator had mentioned, high rates of Lyme disease, property and landscape damage to the abutting properties around Blue Hills Reservation, and then vehicle collisions, again, as the Senator had mentioned. So this is just an interpretive sign that we have out in the reservation. Back in 2011, we started putting up deer exclosures. These are small fenced-in areas where we want to keep the deer out. And what we've seen in a couple of these exclosures is vegetation is growing on the inside, but other vegetation on the outside is not developing. So you may get your huckleberry on the outside, you're not getting your tree regrowth on the outside. So I liken the Blue Hills to like an island paradise for deer. It's got this surrounded, protected environment where there's never been hunting, or at least hunting in over 100 years. There haven't been any major predators in a long time. There are coyotes, but they do not significantly decrease the population. And again, there's been no hunting in over 100 years. One of the things that was developed in 2008, 2009, 2010 was DCR's resource management plan. What I liken to a cookbook. This is how we should manage DCR properties. And there was a lot of robust interaction, public interaction, when this plan was developed on how the Blue Hills should be managed. And one of the key things that came out of public meetings and discussions was, what are you going to do about the deer? There were too many deer in the Blue Hills. And so we heard that. We also heard from scientists that vegetation was starting to disappear in the Blue Hills. Wildflowers, plants were starting to disappear in the Blue Hills. It's one of the things that we picked up on in the resource management plan. So a couple of the recommendations that came out of the resource management plan, one was to do a comprehensive deer density survey with the Division of Fish and Wildlife. And then the other was to start thinking about what are you going to do to manage the deer herd. A couple other things that happened simultaneous to our resource management planning efforts. In 2011, some of the surrounding neighbors began a small limited hunt on their own, on their private properties, because they were seeing the effects of too many deer in their areas. As I mentioned, in 2013, we did the deer density survey, and last summer, in June, we presented the findings on, and we'll talk a little bit more about those in a little bit. So after the summer meeting, we really sat down and started thinking about what our next steps were. There were a number of articles. Some of you that live in the area may have seen it in the Patriot Ledger or the Boston Globe, but a number of articles started discussing what the state's next steps were. As the commissioner mentioned, in 2014, there was the environmental bond bill that said that we should be working with Fish and Wildlife to manage the deer herd. In September, we presented the results of the findings to our Stewardship Council and talked about our next steps. And back in the spring of 2015, in May, we sat down with law enforcement officials and really started thinking about the framework of how we would manage this deer population in a safe manner. We combined a working team in the summer of 2015 to really outline the next steps of a plan to manage the deer herd. At this time, I'm going to turn the microphone over to John O'Leary. He's the Assistant Director of Division of Fish and Wildlife, Mass Wildlife, and he's going to talk a little bit about the deer survey and how it was developed. So, John, I'm going to turn the clicker over to you.
Thank you, Peter.
So this tower right there.
Okay. I never talk a little about anything probably, but thank you for having us here tonight. I've been involved in this project for about the last year, since David Stainbrook, the fellow who's our deer biologist who did this sampling for the population estimate here at Blue Hills. And you may wonder why it's important to get at this population estimate, but it allows us to understand where we're starting from. So as we think about the framework and how we're going to try to manage this population, it's important for us to know what that level of population is so we can think about the alternatives as we work through trying to manage them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the techniques that he used to come up with this estimate. So the goal is to try and estimate these deer per square mile of habitat. It was done in May 2013. It's the methodology that they use is called distance sampling. What that is, the two crews, DFW and DCR, went out after nightfall, and they would run these transects with either a vehicle on the paved parts of the reservation or with an ATV, and essentially somebody drives them, two people sit in the back with lights, look off to the side, and when they see a group of deer, note how many deer they see, and then have a distance measuring device that says how far away they are. And as you'd expect, the further away something is, the less likely you are to be able to detect it. So the methodology and the mathematics of this computer program that you put it in accounts for all of that, and then provides you with an estimate of how many, in this case, how many animals you actually would encounter out there in the habitat. So based on that effort, the estimate came up to 85 deer per square mile of forest. As the senator spoke about, that's much higher than we would look at in trying to, for this part of the state, 6 to 18 deer per square mile. In real numbers, that turns out to be somewhere between 600 and 800 deer across the land within the reservation. The deer estimate that we as an agency seek to achieve, the 6 to 18, is somewhat lower than what the forest can sustain. The forest might be able to handle upwards of 18 to 20 deer per square mile. That's when we start to see real impacts to the forest. Would like to keep that number somewhat below it because of the people in the area, the encounters with cars and everything else. So our management goals are somewhat just below that, what the forest can sustain. When we look across the state how we manage deer as an agency, the western part of the state here, those numbers 1, 2, 3, through 6 or so, those are our wildlife management zones, and this is how we manage wildlife based in those areas. Any of you who hunt, and you try to get your antlers permit, you do it by zone. And when we look where we have good access to property, where our hunters can get out there and hunt, we achieve our goals by keeping the population at or slightly below goal. As we move further and further east, where more and more land is closed to hunting, it becomes more difficult to achieve that goal. So just sort of put this up here to show that hunting can be an effective technique, and it works across the majority of the state. So it's something we're familiar with, and folks in the majority of the state are familiar with. So we have this framework now. We have this estimate of how many deer we see in the habitat at 85, and then we began to look at what our options are to try and reduce that number down to something that's closer to the 18. And so we looked at a variety of different techniques that you're familiar with and people see in the press and public. And I'm going to step through those and think, and we'll talk about how we thought about those. But I want you to think about that as we go through them. Think about what you know about the Blue Hills. I live in the Connecticut River Valley. You're much more familiar with this area than I am, but this is a 7,000-acre contiguous block of mostly forest in an area that's connected to other deer habitat through various forest connections. It's not an island. It's not a fenced-in compound. It's an area where deer can move in and out of it, and they do. And so as we look through these techniques, we bear that in mind as to what's possible and what isn't possible, and that helps shape our thinking of what we can actually accomplish here. Anyway, so first one that folks tend to look at is sterilization and contraception. We would have to permit that in Massachusetts. It isn't something that we would permit, so it's not necessarily a legal option. But that aside, it is expensive. It requires some intensive long-term operation. For the contraception, the contraceptive has to be administered multiple times to be effective. So you handle an animal, you'd have to go back and handle that animal, and that becomes problematic. Sterilization is a technique where you'd actually go and sterilize the does. You'd have to bring them in, operate on them, perform the sterilization, and put them back out into the wild. If you look in the literature, there's an example of where this was tried out at Ithaca, New York, at Cornell University, where they had and have a deer problem out there, and they tried sterilization in that area. They sterilized a large number of females. They put them back into the population, and those females still come back into their reproductive cycle. So while it reduced the number of fawns being produced, the males who want to mate with those females, because they still come into their cycle, it increased the number of males coming into that area. It actually attracted bucks from other areas. So it didn't do anything to reduce the number of deers. It switched it from young fawns to more males coming into the area. That's an experience where you have this movement of animals within and without an area. So that one, it's hard to do. It doesn't seem to be all that effective, and we'll move on to the next one. Trap and transfer. In general, we're not encouraging people to transfer anything, whether it's a squirrel out of your attic or a deer from eastern Mass to western Mass. Moving animals around creates this issue with transferring diseases around. The Division of Fisheries and Wildlife certainly doesn't support that. If you were to try and trap a large number of animals here, you would have to do it at a time when you could induce them into a trap. Food would have to be scarce. Something in the winter, maybe you'd have to set out traps, draw them into it. We have a fancy term, what we call capture myopathy. That's another way of saying these animals get so stressed out when you try to handle them and do that, you end up killing some of them in the process. So even if you tried to trap and transfer them and you think you're going to move them to somewhere else, animals will die during that process as you do that. And again, if you're trying to move them to somewhere, you're moving them into a new habitat where they don't know what's around and have to learn it. There would be a mortality associated with that as well. So physically hard to do, just a difficult task to be effective, and it has its own side effects along with it. Hired culling. This is where you'd actually bring someone into somebody like Wildlife Services, one of the government agencies that deals with these sorts of things, bring them in to kill the animals. We allow that in certain extreme situations, say at airports, where they've got a fenced-in situation, but somebody left the gate open, a tree fell down in a storm and knocked the fence down, and 1 or 2 deer get in, and you don't want those deer encountering an airplane during takeoff or landing. So we do allow that, but not on a large scale. And for us, within the Division of Fisheries and Wildlife, the way we think about wildlife, we think of them as a valuable natural resource. And to reduce them to a product that somebody's just going to kill for the sake of removing them violates what we call our North American model of wildlife conservation, which has sustained our division and fisheries and wildlife in North America for a very long time. So, trap and euthanize, same sort of thing. Trap them and kill them. The issues of trying to trap hundreds of animals, it's a daunting task, certainly not set up to handle it, and then in the end, all you do is reduce them to a take. So did I just go through more than one? Hope not. Anyways, that brings us to regulated hunting. And so within Massachusetts, we have several seasons when you can hunt deer, running from mid-October through the end of the calendar year. So there's a regulatory framework that allows hunting at various times of the year with different methodologies. We have an archery season beginning here in the middle of October. The shotgun season begins the Monday after Thanksgiving, lasts 2 weeks, and then after that we have a primitive arms season, muzzleloader season that runs to the end of the year. So we have a regulatory framework that we wouldn't have to change for a controlled hunt. We can have a managed regulated hunt within that framework without having to go back to our board or ask for any additional changes. So what our preferred option is, when we look at all those things and we think of the deer density at 85, the porousness of this habitat where animals can come in and out of it, we think that a controlled hunt here is the best option. You can add additional restrictions to that. You can limit the number of hunters as they do in Quabbin. We can think of 20 or 30 hunters per square mile of hunting as a safe number of hunters out there to work over the land. You can regulate that number. You can have an application process. You can choose who you want to let in there, successful hunters, that type of thing. You can restrict the implements, and in this case we're talking about a shotgun season to what they would use, and you can limit the season length. We've got 2 weeks of shotgun season. You don't have to use every day of it. You could use up to those 2 weeks of it. So it's important for us to balance all these and then still think about the success of the program. Every time you make a restriction on it, that means fewer people are going to have an opportunity to take a deer, and it's going to take you longer to reach your goal of reducing that population. So with that, I guess I'll turn it back over to Peter. And
thank you very much.
Yep.
So at this time, I want to introduce Dan Clark. He's our Natural Resources Director for the Division of Water Supply Protection for DCR. He's going to talk a little bit about our managed hunt at the Quabbin Reservoir watershed. This has been a highly successful hunt for the last 25 years, and he's going to talk a little bit about the history of that hunt and how it works right now. So Dan?
Good evening, everyone. As Peter mentioned, I'm the Director of Natural Resources for DCR, specifically the Division of Water Supply Protection. I think my role tonight is really to provide the audience with some insights into what is possible and likely outcomes of having a controlled deer hunt. And I sort of tried to focus my information on sort of the ecological response from reducing deer herds when they've been at high deer densities for a long time. And what I'll do is start, people are familiar with Quabbin Reservation, just to sort of set the stage, give you a little background. So Quabbin is part of a large water supply system. This water is delivered to metropolitan Boston, provides water to about 2.5 million people. So it's part of a system. So water from Quabbin flows underground, actually flows into Wachusett Reservoir and then into the distribution system. Interesting thing about this system, it's unfiltered. It's treated but unfiltered. So there's a strong emphasis on watershed protection, making sure the water is as clean as possible before it gets into the reservoir. Very much like the Blue Hills, the structure of Quabbin is very similar. It's primarily forested. In addition to that, it's not just forested, but a lot of it's mature, older forest was established back in the 1930s and before. And it's comprised of a lot of things, but it's a predominantly hardwood forest as well. There's some softwoods too. To give you a sense of the history of deer at Quabbin, so when the reservoir was created back in the 1930s, it was immediately closed off to hunting, all types of hunting, not just white-tailed deer. Not too surprisingly, not long after that, deer populations had increased enough where people started to notice some impacts. And that was, believe it or not, in the mid-40s, people were starting to say, whoa, what's going on here? Nothing was really done at that point up until the early 1990s. We did keep an eye on the deer. We did some deer estimates during the late 80s and early 90s. And some similar numbers to what they saw in the Blue Hills here. We used a similar technique using distance sampling, and we estimated 40 to 60 deer per square mile at the Quabbin. So a lot of deer, similar to what you have here. Just in case people wonder what does 60 deer per square mile actually look like, this gives you a sense of it. So this is one of our hunting zones, Petersham. And if you sort of ran the numbers, this is what 60 deer per square mile would look like on the landscape. So it's about 804 deer. So each one of those dots represents a deer. So it's sort of, it's hard to sort of comprehend numbers, but when you can see it, it's a boatload of deer. So what we experienced at Quabbin was, again, there's a lot of similarities between Quabbin and the Blue Hills. Not just those. If you find a place with lots of deer, you're going to have a similar situation. What tends to happen when there's lots of deer is the forest becomes impacted. Typically, you'll have a situation like this where you'll have mature canopy trees and very, very little vegetation underneath. And there's a simple reason for that. As things pop up and start to grow, they're eaten. When you have 60 deer per square mile, they all have to find something to eat. So a little seedling comes up after being germinated, and a deer will walk by and nip it off. So you're sort of left with this sort of typical scene where you can, in Quabbin, you could literally see for hundreds and hundreds of yards through the woods, because there just wasn't anything underneath. The other thing that tends to happen is you end up with vegetation that deer simply don't like to eat. And in a lot of cases, it tends to be invasive species. This is barberry, Japanese barberry. And at Quabbin, we would have seas and just acres and acres of Japanese barberry, because it's the only thing that could grow. Deer just wouldn't eat it. So in a lot of cases, you'll end up with situations like that, vegetation that you don't want in the understory. The other thing we saw a lot, too, is other types of vegetation. This is actually native, hay-scented fern. Again, it's not eaten by deer. So you'll have vast acreage where everything else that happens to pop up will get eaten. The ferns, which they don't eat, can dominate the understory. And you'll have, this is something that was very, very typical at Quabbin, vast acreages of that. One of the most visually striking things we did at Quabbin is erect these deer exclosures. So these are very small-scale fences. And the idea behind this was it prevented deer from accessing these small fenced-in areas. So that visually it represents, here's what grows in the absence of deer, and on the outside, here's what grows in the presence of high deer densities. And you can see the stark contrast between the two. This is fenced in, and this is unfenced. Here you just an amazing array of vegetation, diversity of tree species, herbaceous vegetation. On the outside, it's mostly grasses and perennials, things that either can withstand deer browsing or things that simply deer don't eat. So it's a good visual way to sort of recognize the impacts deer can have. So I won't go into the whole history, but suffice to say, we began a deer management program in 1991 with the idea that we recognized that the forest was not the way we wanted it to be. From our concern, from a water quality perspective, we were concerned that if anything happened to the overstory trees, there was nothing underneath to quickly take the place of those overstory trees that were lost. And from a water quality perspective, that's a bad situation. You want vegetation there to immediately respond and grow back up into the canopy. So our program started in 1991. This graph simply represents the deer harvest since the beginning of the hunts. So in 1991, there's two axes here. On the left side is just the number of deer we harvested in that particular year, and the right side is just another way of showing it. It's the number of deer harvested per square mile. The interesting thing about the map, the graphs really want to show you is within a relatively short period of time, we're able to reduce the deer densities substantially. So we went in there and hunted, got the deer densities down to levels that were much more compatible with our regeneration and forest management goals. And we've been able to maintain those densities relatively stable over the last 15, 20 years. So the big question is, that's great, you got the deer densities down, what happened? Did you get the response you were expecting and hoped for? The answer is yes. We're delighted with what happened to the forest. And probably the most important piece of information that we track is this graph right here. So this is regeneration, trees. The first bars represent 1989, before the hunt. What you can see is there were very, very few trees on the forest. And we measure these trees as stems per acre. So you go out and take some measurement plots and come up with the stems per acre count. In general, what you're looking for is 2,000 stems per acre. This is sort of the general accepted level. You need about 2,000 stems per acre in the understory to ensure that you'll have trees in the overstory. You can see we were well below that threshold. It's not where we want it to be. However, the real encouraging thing is this trend. So since we began hunting deer in 1991, the forest has responded tremendously. So we find ourselves in the many thousands of tree stems per acre. Probably more important is this second green graph. This represents those trees that are at least 4.5 feet tall. So the general sense in ecology is once a tree gets above 4.5 feet, it's sort of made it past the deer. So it now can sort of release and get into the overstory. So that's really the critical number. How many trees at that height do you have out on the landscape? And as you can see, again, we're above that 2,000 stems per acre. So we made really good progress. It's probably one of the best in terms of forest management decisions we ever made, was going out there and managing the deer densities. We never would have seen these numbers without it. So I showed you some pictures of what the forest looked like before we hunted deer. Now I'm going to show you a series of pictures of what the forest looks like now. I had the fortune, I was in college at the time when the deer hunt started, but I got to spend some time on Quabbin, so I got to see the before. And as I mentioned, you could walk, I could see from here to the back of the room and well beyond through the forest. There was just nothing underneath. When you go out now, this was an opening we made using silviculture. You could see this flush of vegetation. There's a diversity of tree species in there. It just, this immediate response when there's sunlight and the forest starts to regenerate. This is another great example. You start to see this multi-layered forest, which is really what we're trying to achieve. You have overstory trees, you have mid-story trees, and you have understory trees. And this sort of redundancy throughout the forest. And this is a typical scene. So you have some small trees, you have some bigger trees in the back, and then some overstory trees as well. Another great example of that multi-layer, multi-age forest out at Quabbin. Scenes like that you just wouldn't see in the past. And another good example. So I tried to throw in a little bit of, you can see how well the forest responded. So I tried to give you also a little bit of a sense of, well, what else made responses now that the forests had changed, the habitat communities had changed. So we've been doing breeding bird surveys for a long time out at Quabbin. And again, I threw in some numbers here before the hunts began, so in the late 80s and early 90s. And I picked out some species that I really think highlight the differences. So these species, the towhee, the common yellowthroat, the chestnut-sided warbler, are species that are really associated with this diverse forest layers. So you rarely see them in forests that are sort of open with just the canopy. They like that multi-age, multi-structured forest. And what you can see is back in the early years, before we started hunting deer, we didn't see those species very often. They were uncommon. And as we've hunted and as the forest has diversified, we're starting to see more and more of those species that are responding, that the habitat's now there, they come in and they can take advantage of it. So it's a little glimpse on some of the ecological changes. And then a couple more quick things. It's not just forest tree species that have responded too, but we're seeing things that you never would have seen in previous years before deer management took place. A lot of your herbaceous plants. So a lot of these plants are some of the first things to go. Deer love to eat them. And if they're out there, they'll find them and eat them quickly. But we're starting to see things now, and this ecological diversity is really starting to rebound. So even simple things like brambles, raspberries and blackberries, pretty tough to find out there before. Now we see them, they're common. A lot of wildflowers are starting to show up where weren't there before. Poison ivy, not all good things. You know, poison ivy's coming back. They actually eat that too. So, but you know, it's part of the system as well. Some more examples. So these are all things that we now see on a fairly regular basis that were essentially absent prior to 1991. And the interesting thing too is ruffed grouse and rabbits. I don't think there was a ruffed grouse within 10 miles of Quabbin before. It was just the absolute wrong type of habitat. Same with rabbits. You can sort of picture where they like the shrubby, lots of vegetation, hard to walk through, that sort of thing. Never saw them before. Now we actually see them quite often. So things like that are. So quickly, just to conclude, we were able to successfully reduce deer densities at Quabbin within a relatively short period of time and maintain those densities at levels that allowed for these ecological responses to take place. We now are able to regenerate trees, develop this multi-age, multi-layer forest that we desire. Diversity is still not where we want it to be. We would rather have a wider range of tree species. We're getting there. It's hard to overcome 50 years of severe browsing. The forest takes a long time to recover. We're starting to see those changes and we're going in the right direction, but we still have a little ways to go. And then this general ecosystem diversity is really, really taken off in the form of all these different communities that are now present that weren't before. So again, the forest is slow. You know, you've got to think in decades or centuries when you're talking about a forest. So patience, but everything is going in the right direction. So we're pleased with the outcomes. I think it's back to Pete.
All right. Thank you very much, Dan.
Hello, I just wanted to recognize Representative Cusack of Braintree. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dan. So now what I want to do is get into the nuts and bolts of our draft deer management plan. And I believe we have copies in the back, so everyone should grab a copy if you don't have one. So 4 key elements that we worked on when we developed this draft deer management plan. First and foremost was public safety. We wanted to make sure that hunters were safe. We wanted to make sure the public was safe. We wanted to make sure stakeholders and neighbors were safe. That was a key element in how we formulated this plan. Resources. We wanted to make sure we had the adequate amount of staffing resources to manage a hunt like this. We wanted to be effective. We wanted to make sure that we are doing what we set out to do and reduce the deer herd. And then finally, we wanted to limit the amount of time that we had a managed hunt. So we wanted to make sure that we were as least invasive as possible when it comes to having an actual hunt during the course of the managed hunt. So in this first year, what the plan says is following a system very similar to Quabbin, where we would have hunters apply to participate. It would be a lottery system. Hunters would need a valid FID card and hunting license, and we would be choosing randomly from the applicant pool using a lottery system. Again, we would be doing this managed hunt during shotgun season. It would be a total of 4 days, 2 days on a Monday and Tuesday, the 30th and 1st of December, and then the following Monday and Tuesday of the following week. So 4 total days, 2 days each week. And it would be shotgun only, no buckshot. It would just be slug. And we would look at archery maybe down the road, but certainly not for this first year. We would select a total of 240 hunters, and that would mean 120 hunters each week. So there would only be 120 hunters for those first 2 days of Monday and Tuesday, and then 120 other hunters the following week. We would also have a mandatory distribution pattern of where the hunters could go. So we would let the hunters know in certain areas where they would be. So based on acreage, we would assign hunters to specific areas. What we were looking at was a very conservative estimate of 1 hunter per every 30 acres, and they would have to stay within their management zone. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about the reservation itself. So for many of you for just point of reference, we're here at the Ponkabuck Golf Course right now. The green areas would be huntable areas in the first year. And it would be everything north of Route 93 and 128, everything north of that. Everything south would not be huntable for the first year. And then again, based on acreage, we would assign, for instance, the Great Blue area, 25 hunters per that zone, 3 hunters in Little Blue, 13 hunters in Foul Meadow, 22 hunters in the Houghton's Pond section, and then on the east side of the park, 35 hunters in Chickatawbut, and then 22 hunters in Wampatuck. And the green areas are the huntable areas. The red areas are off limits. Those are either roadways or neighborhoods. This is the top of Great Blue Hill. This would be off limits. And then we specifically omitted the southern part of this. Again, we wanted to make sure that we had adequate resources to manage this hunt. And B, we wanted an area where if people wanted to be out in the reservation, we would point them in this direction to the Ponkabuck section during the hunt. Again, similar to the Quabbin, we would have a mandatory hunter orientation, and that all permittees would be required to go through this hunter orientation. And participants would also be required to purchase 2 antlerless permits. So again, the goal is to cull the herd. On the day of the hunts, we would have a central location. The Houghton's Pond parking lot would be our main staging area. We would have check-in times from 5 to 7 a.m., and then we would have a specific checkout time of 4 p.m. We want all the hunters out of the woods at 4. Now, at that time of year, sunlight sunsets around 4:30. We would want everybody out of there so that when it's dark, no one's left in the reservation. We would also have a stub permit system so that hunters would need to check back in to the main staging area to give us their permit stub so that we know they're out of the woods. In terms of the actual hunt itself, we would require hunters to clean their deer off of any hiking trail, at least 100 feet off of hiking trails. Hunters would be responsible for transporting their deer to their vehicles and then on to the deer check station, and all harvested deer must be checked. Some of the closures that we would do are restricting access. We endeavor to close Chickatawbut Road east of Route 28. So where there are gates on Chickatawbut Road heading over to Quincy and Wampatuck Road, we would close that section for the 2 days each week. And we would reopen it at 5 o'clock at the end of the hunt on that Monday and Tuesday, so commuters can still utilize it. There would be no parking along 93, and we would also, we're going to be talking a little bit about variable message boards. We'd be having message boards in specific areas, especially along Route 28, which is right in the middle of the reservation, to alert people that there is a hunt in progress. We want to have traffic calming systems so that people know that if deer are going across the road, they should be alert and cognizant of that. There would be no access by hunters with vehicles on trails. And again, we would be posting the variable message boards a few weeks out of the hunt, A, to announce the hunt dates, B, to announce road closures. These are the areas that hunters would be allowed to park at, and these are scattered throughout the reservation where hunters would be assigned. We would have a strict adherence to any violation. So if anyone's violating any type of this managed hunt, they would be taken off the premises. We would definitely adhere to that strictly. They would also not be allowed to hunt in any future years. We are also talking about restricting public access in the areas that will be hunting on those 2 given days each week. We will have a robust public information process. Again, we're at the start of it right now with the public meetings. We've had some press announcements. We will have the variable message board set up, and we will have signage at trailheads. We'll also be notifying abutters of the hunt going on so that they are aware of it. We will also have contact information at our headquarters, at State Police, at Mass Audubon, Trailside Museum, so that people are aware of the hunt. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Chief Ranger Jennifer Stowe. She's going to talk a little bit about the Unified Command System and introduce our partners with Massachusetts State Police and the Environmental Police. Jennifer.
Thank you, Peter. Once again, my name is Jennifer Stowe. I'm the Chief Park Ranger for the Department of Conservation and Recreation. And my primary goal with this plan is to coordinate and implement a public safety plan. As several folks here have said, that is our primary concern, is that we can provide a controlled hunt with public safety as our #1 priority. We've already started that process. You know, we had the opportunity to meet with several of the police chiefs or their designees for all the towns involved, and we took all of their concerns very seriously, and when we went back to the drawing table, you know, we implemented or we tweaked our plan to really take their concerns into consideration. We continue to meet on a regular basis, and one of those ideas that came out of that was we are going to have a unified command. And basically what that means is during the 4 days of the hunt, we're going to have a representative from all of the agencies, DCR, Environmental Police, State Police, all of the local police, together in one room where we can effectively use communication to talk with each other. So if there is an issue that arises, we'll be able to get that information out. There'll hopefully be a public number as well. So we do anticipate that there may be a few folks out there that didn't hear about this plan, that this is going to happen, and they may hear gunfire. So what's their first instinct? They're going to call 911. This is going to be the ability for the 911 dispatchers to transfer it over to the Unified Command, and then we can go out and check to make sure that that's a permitted hunter. This works in a lot of different scenarios, a Unified Command, and it works very well, so we'll be doing that. Peter did mention education is really paramount for this public safety plan. So we do have some folks from our Blue Hills Ranger staff as well as from the South Region Visitor Services, and they're really working hard to create that signage and that information that we're going to pass out. So as the Rangers are out there patrolling, they're going to be handing out rat cards with all of the information regarding this plan. I would like to take the opportunity to give our partners a little moment to speak. So if I could have Lieutenant DeRoche from the Environmental Police please come forward.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Phil DeRoche. I'm the lieutenant for the South Shore coastal towns in Massachusetts. I've been with the Environmental Police for about 22 years now, both on the Cape and then on the South Shore. Now, with the Blue Hills Hunt, we'll be primarily supporting DCR and Fish and Game through enforcing, we'll have four priorities. We'll be enforcing the general and special laws, rules, and regulations that are going to be in place during the hunt. We'll be responding to any hunting accidents or incidences that may occur during the hunt. Prior to the hunt, we anticipate patrolling the reservation, try and clear out pre-existing tree stands and any bait that may be in place that are currently in violation. And then lastly, we'll be responding to any reports or on overdue hunters. The Environmental Police, for those of you who don't know who we are, we're the state analogy of a game warden. We do hunting and fishing enforcement, trapping, boating enforcement, ATVs. During the fall of the year, we do quite a bit of hunting enforcement, and our officers are quite comfortable interacting with armed hunters. So we don't anticipate any kind of incidences. In Massachusetts, the traditional hunting accident that we have is most commonly a fall out of a tree stand. The second most common hunting accident would be on a stalked pheasant hunt where one shooter is swinging on game and inadvertently hits another hunter with pellets. In that case, it tends to be a tiny, tiny pellet of lead that gets embedded in the skin, and they tend to be very minor injuries. Those are by far the greatest hunting accidents that we have here in the Commonwealth. There have been very, very few accidents involving the deer hunting season, primarily with shotgun, a few with bow, where a hunter, again, will fall out of a tree stand and impale themselves on their arrow. So we don't anticipate any accidents. DCR's choice of limiting this to a shotgun hunt with slug only eliminates the possibility of swinging on game. Generally, when you use buckshot, there's a greater tendency to swing on your animal and try and shoot a moving animal. With a slug, you only have that single projectile with which to kill the animal. So you have to aim carefully and take a well-aimed, careful shot. Because of that, there's a greater likelihood that the hunter's going to take an extra moment, identify the game, identify the sex, and then ensure that they're not shooting at something they're not supposed to be shooting. Additionally, a slug has a maximum range of about 400 or 500 yards, as opposed to a rifle round, which could go up to, say, 3 miles. So limiting the shot distance to 500 yards and having laws in place that limit being more than 500 yards from a dwelling minimizes the likelihood of a round hitting someone's property. Again, shot isn't buckshot, birdshot, those won't be in place in this hunt. So we're looking at about a 500-yard safety zone or danger zone around a hunter. Their density of 1 hunter per 30 acres gives hunters plenty of room to have safe shooting areas, plus the use of tree stands will be able to allow them to set up a safe shooting shot. We'll be around later in the evening. You have particular questions regarding hunting, enforcement and the laws and whatnot, and I'd be happy to take them. Thank you. Oh, incidentally, for this hunt, we'll be delegating 8 officers, which is about 10% of our staff. So we're going to man it as best we can with what we have.
Thank you, Lieutenant. Now I'd like to ask Captain King from the Massachusetts State Police to come forward.
Hey, good evening, everyone. Captain Joseph King, Massachusetts State Police. I work in Troop H headquarters in South Boston. I've been a trooper for over 21 years, and I've been a Canton resident since 2007. I'm originally from Dorchester, but moved to Canton. I know there's a lot of originally from Dorchester people here. I think that's how I discovered the place. I visited my friends who moved here, so I moved here myself in '07, and I like it. So far, so good. And for the deer hunt, the Mass State Police will be working with the Environmental Police and the DCR. We'll be mostly doing the traffic management portion of it. We'll be assisting the DCR with the road closures. We'll have a trooper in the UCC all day for all 4 days of the hunt, and we'll be working out on 93 and Route 28 with the traffic calming measures that they discussed. We'll be enforcing the no parking and the traffic calming. So I'll also be around after if you have any questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So after the hunt happens, we are going to assess how it went. We're also looking at long-term phased implementation plan. So it's not just a one-year thing. We're going to figure out how we did this first year and then phase the next steps. We're also going to, as Dan had mentioned at Quabbin, we're going to do vegetation regeneration sampling surveys. We've started that this summer. We have, as I mentioned, a couple deer exclosures. We're going to put up a couple more because we want to assess the impacts of reducing the herd. So for additional information, you can go on to DCR's website, to our public meeting section, and if you want to submit comments, we're allowing comments till October 2nd. We have 2 more public meetings next week, one at Trailside Museum and one over in Quincy. But before we get into questions and answers, I'd like to introduce Judy Jacobs. She's the Executive Director of the Friends of the Blue Hills, who's been a strong partner in trying to figure out how we deal with this deer situation. I also want to introduce the President of the Friends of the Blue Hills, Denise Swenson, who also is very knowledgeable about the issue. So Judy?
Hi, the Friends of the Blue Hills has been working with the DCR to protect and preserve the Blue Hills forests, trails, and amazing views for over 35 years for people today and for generations to come. So the heart of our mission is both the forests and the people who visit it, which is why we care about this issue. And I have to admit, initially I had no interest in working on deer hunting in the Blue Hills. Personally, I was a vegetarian for years, and I don't take killing animals lightly. Organizationally, we had no interest in taking on a controversial issue. But about 6 years ago, I did a series of one-on-one meetings with over 70 people in the community to find out what they cared about in terms of the Blue Hills and in terms of open space in general. And I met with people like Denise Swenson and others who were concerned about Lyme disease. And I met with other people who didn't live close by but wouldn't visit the Blue Hills anymore because they were afraid of getting Lyme disease again. At the same time, we were also trying to recruit people to weed in the forest, which is quite a difficult task. So we had just a handful of people up on Great Blue pulling black swallowwort for several hours in the hot sun. And I looked up and I still saw a sea of this invasive weed covering the forest floor. And an ecologist who was there at the time explained that part of the problem and part of the reason that there were so many invasives was because there are so many deer. And that the deer, as was explained, avoid the invasives and eat the natives, and that has repercussions for the whole forest. So we decided as an organization that cares of people that care deeply about both the forest and its inhabitants and the visitors, we felt like we needed to work on this issue. So we had a 3-prong approach. The first was Lyme disease education, and we partnered with Milton Public Schools and Milton Department of Health to teach Milton students about Lyme disease prevention and awareness. And each year we talked to over 300 students. We also dramatically increased the number of people that volunteer to remove invasives. Each year, over 100 people remove barberry that was mentioned, as well as black swallowwort and other invasive species that are harming sensitive habitats. And lastly, we started talking to the DCR and other decision makers about the core problem of deer populations. And we support the DCR's current draft deer management plan to reduce deer populations through a managed hunt. I can't comment on the specifics of the draft because that's not our specialty or our area of expertise. But I can say that there are too many deer and that they're harming the forest, and we're really glad that DCR has taken this on as an issue to address.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Commissioner Sanchez. My name is Denny Swenson. If you could cue up the map. I'm not a hunter, and I'm like Judy, I'm not someone who came to this approach lightly. This took a number of us who are sitting up here a number of years to come to this solution and realization that we need to bring the deer population down for the health of the forest and for the health of the visitors. For me, the deer issue started with myself and my husband coming down with 2 terrible cases of Lyme disease. I was rather sick for about 3 months and 2 series of antibiotics. And my husband got really knocked down by it, but we're fine. And I became aware that this was a broader issue when the kids and parents at the bus stop were all coming down with it and talking about it, and we were rather concerned. You know, as we would walk to the bus stop, we would be passing, you know, house after house and realizing that most of the houses there were people in those houses who had been dealing with Lyme disease. We did a neighborhood survey, and about 30 households responded, and they reported 30 cases of Lyme disease. We collected ticks in our neighborhood, and 7 out of 10 ticks along Green Street tested positive for Lyme disease, and 9 out of 11 ticks on Hemingway Drive tested positive for Lyme disease, and 9 out of 11 ticks on Hemingway Drive tested positive for anaplasmosis. So as a neighborhood, we went through a research process exploring every possible strategy. We were sort of on a parallel path, you know, in an attempt to address our concerns. And the studies, the research, the experts, in the end, all turned to the same problem, which is the overabundance of deer. This can be debated, and I realize that even if or when we get the deer population down, we may not see the Lyme rate go down for many years. But in the meantime, we've learned so much about the ecosystem and the deer impact on the understory and all the other animals and plant life that are impacted by this imbalance. When I hear about how the rabbits have returned to the Quabbin, you know, it gives me hope, because it would be so great to have rabbits and birds and other plants and bugs return to our neighborhood that we haven't seen in ages. Because like the Quabbin, we have had so much understory devastation. We have these deer corridors that run through our neighborhood, and in some areas you can see them getting wider and wider each year, and unfortunately drier and drier. And you know, in some areas there's some real risk of forest fires. So we've had a variety of public meetings over the years, and the DCR has too. And we started a private hunting program on private property. This has been running for about 5 years. Within a year, we plateaued out at harvesting 15 deer a year, half bucks, half does. And on just a side note, years ago, before we started this program, we noticed there were hunters who were showing up in our neighborhood uninvited to hunt. And since our hunting program has organized us as a neighborhood, we have a variety of ways of tracking this trespassing. And I just want to be clear to any hunters who show up on private property, they will be immediately reported to the police, and they will be arrested. And we take this very seriously as a public safety issue, and we won't tolerate that sort of aggressive behavior in our neighborhood. All hunters in our program have been screened and vetted. We've checked for their any arrest records and so forth. We have all the hunters we want at this time. So if I could just point to this map. Our neighborhood is surrounded by DCR property. We're the Friends of Little Blue is what we call ourselves. And you know, our little neighborhood hunting program, although it's harvesting 15 deer a year, as soon as we create a void, it immediately gets filled in by the deer that are on Foul Meadow and Little Blue and Great Blue. So although we feel it's a successful program, we can't solve our neighborhood problems without the DCR managing the overpopulation of deer on their property. So we can't take care of our property until they are able to take care of their property. And we are neighbors with the DCR, and we need to work together, and we're grateful that we are. And we're grateful to Senator Joyce, who we sat down with at the little Dunkin' Donuts down the road and so many years ago, and he's really taken on an advocacy role and advocated strongly for our neighborhoods. The Friends of Blue Hills has stepped up, and as Judy mentioned, we have the Go Out and Play, Check Every Day program, and we do a lot of health awareness on the line and through emails. We go into the 4th grade future problem solver classrooms with Petri dishes containing ticks. So the 4th graders, bugs always go 4th graders, but they can identify the ticks as sometimes as small as the dot of a pencil, all the way up to the size of a small eraser. And Judy talks about the importance of the ecosystem and what happens when you have an imbalance with the understory, and the town nurse talks to them about the signs and symptoms of Lyme disease and what to do if you find a tick on your person. So it's part of our health awareness program with the idea that a pound of prevention is worth a ton of cure, because most of the horrible aspects can be avoided by prevention or early detection. So health awareness is important, but with it alone, we have not been able to turn the tide on this incredible rate of disease in our neighborhood. So dealing with the deer is a key part of addressing the health of the forest and its visitors. And nobody here is suggesting that this hunt is going to solve the Lyme disease problem. The DCR are coming at this with land management goals and you know, very quantifiable scientific goals here. This is what they do. They're bringing the deer population down because of their concern about the deforestation in the Blue Hills. But having looked at all the science available on possible options for bringing Lyme disease rates down, I'm personally convinced that bringing the deer population down overall will, over time, have a positive impact on the incidence of Lyme. Every case of tick-borne illness we prevent is a win for the community. Neighborhoods like mine that live in or along the Blue Hills forests are grateful because addressing the deer overpopulation for their property management issues will allow us a fighting chance to deal with the deforestation issues that we're facing in our neighborhoods. The Board of the Friends of Blue Hills is in support of a controlled hunt with significant safety features managed by the DCR. And just on a final side note, Judy and I have been talking with the DCR about these issues for years, and they have held a variety of meetings with a variety of experts. As the first phase was we went through a long year or two of just acknowledging that we have a problem. And there was a lot of science and a lot of experts that went into that. And then the second phase was all about studying and assessing the problem. And there was a lot of science that went into that. And then for the last, I would say, year and a half maybe, they've been analyzing a variety of ways to address the problem. So having been involved in so many of these meetings over the years, I understand the thinking and the logic behind a lot of these decisions that they've made and their approach, but I also understand that many of you haven't been involved in the process. So I just wanted you to know that it was a long and thoughtful process that included a number of community stakeholders and a diversity of expert voices. So we're all looking forward to this part of the public process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Denny, and thank you, Judy. At this point in time, I'm going to open it up to questions and answers for all of us. So I'm going to be the MC on the Q&A. What I'd ask is if you could just give your name and where you live, and then give your question, that would be great. And we do have microphones over on the side, either side. So who wants to start? Yes, sir.
My name is Dave Hodgson. I'm head of Blue Hill Adventures Quarry Museum, and I've been involved in the Blue Hills for most of my life, and I'm in the Blue Hills every day. And I've had one dog that's passed away. He had Lyme disease and when I got it, and I have a current dog who has it as well. But I've seen a decline in the ticks this year. I haven't seen any. And I've been all over the Blue Hills, and at this point, I think they're on the decline. Again, I am not a biologist per se, but I'm knowledgeable about it. I'm concerned on the second phase of the proposed hunting in the Blue Hills. We are active here in the Blue Hills year-round, hiking, cross-country skiing, snowshoeing in the wintertime, and mountain biking. And we're in an urban area. There's no question about it. I back right up to the Blue Hills in Randolph, and I get deer, I get turkeys through my yard, and I can count 10 or 15 sometimes at a time. Just a few weeks ago, I found right across the street from me 10 turkeys there. And one of them had got inside someone's fence, so I had to go let him out. He finally flew out. The concern I have is when you open the Blue Hills or restrict the Blue Hills to the recreation use, and then you bring guns into the Blue Hills, there's too many openings where people can come in. You can't close them off. You only have, I think, 1 or 2 rangers if they're on duty in the 8,000 plus Blue Hills, and you have other police forces around, but many of them don't operate in the Blue Hills. And I am afraid when you open it up to hunting with shotguns, you're putting yourself at risk and people are going to get hurt. And I'm concerned about that. I would rather see you set up salt blocks in key deer areas and cull them out with basically bows and arrows, professional hunters. That would be the best and the safest way to do it. So that's my feeling in my 40, 50 years of experience in the Blue Hills. And as I say, I'm very concerned about opening the Blue Hills because it's an urban park. And lots of people here, and you don't know where they're coming in from or going out. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hodgson. Yeah, just as you mentioned, public safety is our major concern. We want to make sure that everyone is safe. Again, hunters, neighbors, anyone that's in the immediate area. And that's why within the plan, we feel that we've developed a plan that will restrict access in certain spots. We're doing it at a time of year when there's not a lot of activity in the Blue Hills on a Monday and Tuesday, the beginning of December. We think that this is a very good time of year to do it when there won't be a lot of recreation activity. Other questions? Yes, sir.
I'm Peter Morrissey. I've lived in Braintree since 1972. I hike the Blue Hills every day during the week, and I've also hiked extensively in Quabbin. Comparing a hunt in Quabbin and a hunt in the Blue Hills, I think, is really not equal. Mm-hmm. I mean, sending hunters out into the Quabbin, nobody lives there. I mean, they lived there since 1932 when they buried it. But I do have a couple of studies that I would just like to quote briefly, and people can look them up if they like. The first is from the Tufts Center for Animal and Public Policy. And they talk about something called immunocontraception. There's a town just north of New York City, Hastings on the Hudson. It's kind of like Milton and Canton. And they have this community has a strong character of nonviolence. Maybe even a lot of people in Milton and Canton feel that same way. And here we're picking a violent solution. I mean, I have grandchildren, and I would not advise my grandchildren to pick a violent solution, but to look for a nonviolent solution to a problem. And in Hastings-on-the-Hudson, they achieved a reduction of 50% of their deer in 5 years, which I think is pretty good. Now, the other study that I would like to cite is from the National Academy of Sciences. There's an article in their journal of 2012, and it talks about Lyme disease and the reduction of deer predators being the main cause of that. I mean, the predators are gone, so the deer are living. And they also said there's this poor spatial correlation between deer abundance and Lyme disease incidence. The small mammal host may be more responsible for continuing the emergence of Lyme rather than the deer. And the decline of the small mammal predators can sharply increase the Lyme risk. And I guess basically that's all I have to say.
Thank you, sir. John, do you want to possibly comment on those studies?
The deer tick study, we've got a 2014 paper that just came. David Steinbrook, our deer biologist, was looking through these. So it's a 2014. It's in the Journal of, thank you. It's in the Journal of Medical Entomology. It's by Kilpatrick et al. You can look it up, or I'm sure we can put it on the webpage here. It's a 2014 report. It comes from Connecticut, where they did some deer hunting there. And essentially, when they got the deer density through their 2 years of hunt down to about 13 deer per square mile, they saw an 80% reduction in resident reported cases of Lyme disease. So this is all things considered. It's not just transmittance and everything, but just the relationship between reducing that deer density and a reduction in the incidence of Lyme disease. I've just seen this in the last couple of weeks. It's, typically when we think about Lyme disease and trying to get deer numbers down, to the previous thinking had been you really have got to reduce those numbers down very low. But 13 is within that range that we seek to manage here. So, and that wasn't a magic number that they picked. It was just what their deer hunt had reduced that population down to. So we'll provide this so folks can take a look at it for their own, edification. But there's new information. Yep.
From the proceedings of the National Academy.
Yeah, let's.
I'm sorry. May I give you this? This is a study. It seems to me quite reputable that 2012 proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that suggests that the correlation is with the lowering of the fox population and the growth of the coyote population and the lack of predators for small mammals. And I would appreciate you respectfully looking at this. May I be a voice for the deer? I hike in the Blue Hills every day. To my mind, I understand and very respectful of the vegetation issues that you describe very persuasively. You are turning an urban oasis into a place of violence. I understand that what I'm saying has practically no support here. I see school children come from the city, many, many days. I am there in the winter. I have questions about some of your numbers. I'd like some more explication of how you reach that 85 per square mile, because as I said, I hike every day on both sides. When I look at that, I'm completely distraught about what the Blue Hills is going to become. And I understand that that's a question of values. And, you know, do you mind if I just give you this study? I'd also like to ask one other thing, and then I won't take any more time. Have you been in any contact with Dr. Alan Rutberg, who is at Tufts Veterinary School, and he is the scientist who designed the Hastings-on-Hudson. And I'd like to just give you the New York Times article. I'd really appreciate at least that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Other questions? Over here.
Yes, my name is Steve Rashik. I'm from Barre, Mass., which is in the Quabbin area, and I represent the Massachusetts Animal Rights Coalition, which has over 5,000 members in the state. 2 of our board members have Lyme's disease, so Lyme's disease does not necessarily pick and choose who gets it. I think what we've heard from the last few speakers is the question of whether deer hunting is going to reduce Lyme's disease is highly controversial. Dr. O'Leary is citing a study done over a period of 2 years. Ticks could easily rebound. And we don't know in that Connecticut study what will happen in 3, 5, 6, 8 years. What we do know is that what you're proposing is over 4 years an 80% reduction in deer in the Blue Hills. And that's a massive reduction. I was speaking to a trophy hunter today on the phone who called it not a reduction phase, as it's being called, but a bloodbath. And I think that's what we're going to have here. Furthermore, I'm from Pennsylvania. My father and grandfather were deer hunters. And so I've seen a lot of deer hunting. You may control the hunters, but you won't necessarily control the deer. When hunters come into an area shooting shotguns where deer have never been shot at before, they're going to run. And this is not the Quabbin area. The population density in Petersham is 14 humans per square mile. You just cited information that there are 650,000 people in the nearby area. So I think what we're going to see is when those deer run, they're going to run into the streets, they're going to run into the highways, and they're going to run into people's yard. And I've seen a gut-shot deer bleeding to death in my yard, and I assure you that none of you will want to see that. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Other questions? Yes, in the back.
Yeah, I'm Jay Thurwalt, a lifelong Milton resident, and my property borders the reservation. And next door to me is a daycare. And I was wondering on the no hunting zone, what the distance is from the neighborhoods. I know the officer said that the, shot would go 500 yards. Can you tell us what that distance is?
500 yards is the borders that we have.
Okay, so the neighbors are going to have 500 yards of buffer zone. Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
I have a question as I look at the map there. My name is Jack McClellan from Canton, Mass. As I look at the map there, and I'm concerned from the law enforcement as far as the hunters taking all that area. What would prevent people who are not permitted from going in there and doing a hunt where there are so many deer? And how would you identify the people who rightfully have a permit and those who won't? And will there be adequate law enforcement to enforce that?
So are you saying in this particular area?
In the whole area itself.
So as the lieutenant had mentioned, we will have EPOs in every specific area that there's hunting going on. They'll need to, the hunters that, the valid hunters need to have a permit with them at all times, and they need to be identified that they're a part of this hunt.
How will they identify? Will they have something on them?
They'll have a visible permit that they'll have to wear.
And there'll be only 10 environmental police in that area, the hunting area?
So I'm not exactly sure in terms of how you'll set them up, but in terms of areas, the one thing about the Blue Hills is that there are pinch points where there aren't a lot of general public. So if this roadway is closed, the Chickatawbit Road area, There'll be staff there. There'll be staff at the other end of Wampatuck, staff at Chickatawbut, and there'll be roamers that will be in these areas in general, too. So,
Just seems like 10 environmental police, and you're going to have some at the checkpoints. You don't have any rovers going around there to make sure you don't have hunters that are not permitted in that area. And when there's such a deer population, if a shotgun person finds out that this is open, hey, they can get in there. It's such a large area.
I think with both the combination of the EPOs, the Mass State Police, our DCR Rangers, and DCR staff, there'll be a lot of presence, a lot of state presence throughout the area. Other questions? You in the back?
My name is Sue Daler, and I live on Hillside Street in the Houghton's Pond area. And there's quite a bit of abundance of private forested land in my area. And when you say there's a 500-foot buffer zone, I'm wondering how those buffer zones will be delineated and whether or not those are from the property lines themselves or if it's another area.
So are you talking about this particular area?
Houghton's Hillside Street that runs between...
Right along here?
Yeah. No, well, it's actually further up towards Randolph. There's
down this way.
Yeah.
So, so these areas in red, so anything around Houghton's Pond will be off limits, and these key areas where the roadways are essentially our buffers. So nothing will be huntable south of Hillside right here. It's just to the north. So there'll be no hunting allowed in this entire area.
Will the areas be flagged off, or how will they be delineated?
We will be issuing maps to all the hunters specific to their zones that they're going to be at, and it'll be addressed at the hunter orientations as well on what areas will be allowed, which areas won't be. And again, we will be having a presence, so there'll be a presence certainly here, and there'll be a presence along the Houghton's Pond section as well.
Thank you.
Yep. Yes, ma'am.
Ann Ladd, Canton. Thank you. For how many years do you project this controlled hunt will continue?
I think that's one of the things that we'll have to assess in out years, in future years. We certainly plan on doing another deer density survey either next year, or this coming spring, or the following year to see how effective it's been in terms of reducing the herd. But it'll be a year-by-year, step-by-step basis.
Do you know how many years it went on in the Quabbin area?
It's still going on now. So they went from a reduction phase back in the early 90s to a maintenance phase. So they had a larger area, more days that were being hunted. They've reduced that to 4 days.
Okay, and I'd like to ask Dan Clark if he's still here. He was in the Quabbin. Were there any injuries to humans during those controlled hunts?
No, I'm happy to say since the hunts began in 1991, we've never had a hunting accident at all in the Quabbin hunts. A couple guys get lost sometimes, but we found them. But other than that, nope. What's that? Well, we still have hunters in the woods together.
Okay. Yes, ma'am. There's a microphone coming your way.
My name is Priscilla Hayden Sloan, and I live in Milton. I have two questions. The first would be the selection of Quabbin as a comparison to the Blue Hills, where most of that property has restricted entrance, and the Blue Hills has 0 restricted entrance. And the second question I'd like to ask is if you could walk us through the process of the shift in the decision-making from a bow hunt to a shotgun hunt.
Okay, so with your first question, in terms of, we certainly understand that the Quabbin is a lot more rural. We understand that, but it's a managed hunt, and what we're trying to do is similar to the Quabbin, manage it in a way with restricted areas that will still be safe. So you've got, minus the Ponkabuck section, there's still about 5,000 acres of potentially huntable area. And that's not dissimilar to some of the segments that the Quabbin hunts with a particular number of hunters. So we looked at that as well. In terms of the hunting, bow and arrow versus shotgun, maybe I'll turn that over to you, John.
Typically, when you hunt with a bow and arrow, you're hunting from a fixed position, a tree stand or a ground stand, and the range of the arrow is short. So, so in terms of trying to get an effective hunt to reduce the number of deer in the area, you would have to apply more effort, more time in the woods than you would from people hunting with a shotgun, which has a slightly larger range, and typically the people are moving around and moving the deer around. So in terms of the use of this area, when we talked with DCR about that, if you were to do just a deer only to try and get it from 85, a bow hunt only to try and get it down, it would take you more years, and you may never be effective actually in getting that number down to where you want to without having to put a number of weeks of effort out there. So in terms of interacting with the other users, the shotgun allows you to have a more restricted number of days in the field. The shotgun season occurs later in the season when there's less activity from other users in it, and it's more effective. So there's a combination of those reasons that led us to go in that direction. When you get those numbers down, when the deer density comes down and you get to closer to where you want to be, then bow hunting, in my mind, would be absolutely effective and probably with some few number of days to do it. So it's a matter of going from here down to that maintenance level, and then when you do that, I think you could probably go to a bow hunt with some smaller number of days.
Thank you, John. How about way in the back?
My name is Jake Bennett. I'm from Canton, Massachusetts. I'm a hunter, and I have a pacemaker from Lyme disease. Still go out and do it. I pride myself in filling my freezer with organic food to feed my family. Same question, why not archery when it's been so effective in rural cities or suburban cities such as Cincinnati, Ohio, or Maryland, or other such places? I feel like this is a jump in and a cannonball rather than getting our feet wet.
Yeah, we had a lot of discussion about hunting with bows and versus hunting with shotguns, and ultimately what we wanted to do, and again looking at that first slide that I presented in terms of the 4 key elements of how we put this plan together, was to have as limited number of days as possible to do a managed hunt, and the most viable way to do that was with shotgun. And again, having worked in the Blue Hills for many years, knowing the type of recreation that goes on in November on weekends, we just thought that, again, we wanted to limit the amount of time that we actually had this managed hunt going.
Then why not possibly a 1 to 2 week archery season in February where there's even less interaction with hikers, and it would most likely take away the option for trophy hunting, and would be more about land and population management.
Again, I try to present in that regulatory framework of when we have our bow season, when we have the shotgun season and the primitive arms, those are the existing regulations. Anything outside of that would require a regulatory process to go through that change to make it happen. So we were working within the existing regulatory framework. That's why we picked those days.
One other thing is we also mentioned that hunters will be required to get 2 antlerless permits. So we, again, want to cull the herd. We want does taken especially. Yes. Yes, ma'am.
When I think of the effort that we've put into sharing the park with multi-users, one of the most important factors has been low impact on the park. We restrict use of mountain bikes, we open and close trails, we restrict horseback riding. It would seem to me that then that's the exact opposite. If a bow hunt is, has the least amount of impact and a firearms hunt is moving hunters into all kinds of spaces, not monitoring restricted areas in terms of the environmental space that the public is being asked to respect as users. Again, I think it sends a confusing message that for a couple of days it's okay to do whatever you want, and then everybody needs to go back to following the rules.
Thank you for that comment. I also want to mention that we're looking at 120 hunters. Now, many of you that live around the area know that Blue Hills Reservation on a given day, when you have weekends in October, you have literally thousands of people on this reservation. So 120 hunters is a very minimal impact. Other questions? How about in the back there?
I am against the cull, but I guess the decision's already been made. My issue is that the deer and this land is public. And from the speech that I heard the Pope say today, I'm wondering why people who are hunting have the right to take all the parts of the deer. Why not ask them to give some of this deer meat to either schools in low income areas or to food pantries or to share it rather than allowing them to have the whole deer.
Thank you for that comment. John, do you want to?
We have no regulations against that. As long as the deer is checked and we know it's taken legally, if the hunter wants to donate it to whomever,
I think it should be mandated.
There's no regulations prohibiting it. I can at least say that at this point from the Division of Fisheries and Wildlife.
Maybe that's something that we can incorporate into a voluntary donation. Thank you. Yes, sir.
My name's Hale Smith. I live in Milton and actually abut the Blue Hills Reservation. I've lived in the same location since 1979, and back in 2000, my family actually moved away for 12 years and then came back. And in that period, before we left, we never saw a single deer in our backyard. Upon our return, we've seen up to 8 deer in our backyard. The devastation the ecological devastation in the Blue Hills is been remarkable. I just want to say I think you've done an excellent job thinking through a very difficult problem and coming up with a realistic solution to an environmental issue that's not going to solve itself. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. Other questions? Okay, so we have 2 more public meetings. I would encourage you to, if you have further comments, I think there's information on the back of the table on where you can write your comments to. And again, thank you very much for coming. We appreciate it.